Thank you, Senators. My name is John Lott. I appreciate Senator Mackey for inviting me. I'm president of the Crime Prevention Research Center. I've been chief economist for the U.S. Sentencing Commission, senior advisor for research and statistics in the U.S. Department of Justice, and I've had research and teaching positions at Yale, Stanford, the Wharton Business School, and the University of Chicago. Gun-free zones are a magnet for criminals and mass public shooters. The people who obey these laws are law-abiding citizens. Criminals explicitly pick those areas where, for those attacks, to take advantage of the fact that their victims will be disarmed. You can go through many diaries or manifestos for mass murderers. For example, the Buffalo mass murderer last year wrote about areas where concealed carry is outlawed or prohibited are good areas for attacks. The problem with gun-free zones isn't just that they disarm people in those areas, but they disarm them coming back and forth between those areas. If a woman's being stalked or threatened, it's not just that she doesn't have a gun in that place, but she's unable to defend herself any other place when she's going to or from that. 94% of the mass public shootings occur in these gun-free zones. There's been a lot of talk about the increase in the number of permits in Maryland. Maryland is about 1.8% of the adult population has a permit right now. In Pennsylvania, it's 15%. In Virginia and West Virginia, it's over 10%. Even Delaware is more than twice the rate of permit holders that you have here per capita than in Maryland. And the thing is, you can go and look at the experience. None of those states have the types of gun-free zones that are being talked about being imposed here. None of them have had legislative hearings, let alone votes on trying to rescind those those areas where people are allowed to carry, because there's been no problems. You can look at the rest of the country. What's happened over time is that states, when they initially passed right to carry laws, may have had many, or at least a number of gun-free zones, but they've gotten rid of them over time. And there've been the same predictions being made here now about the problems, and they haven't occurred. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
All right, so we're from Senator West and Senator McKay.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Yes.
So I suspect all of you, except perhaps Mr. Boston, were here earlier in the afternoon when I asked questions of the proponents of this bill. To me, whether or not individual provisions of the bill are good or not, that's of secondary importance. The overriding first question is, are they constitutional? And so I asked questions about whether there were historical precedents for the restrictions provided in the bill, or at least analogs to those restrictions. And as I think you heard, the proponents today weren't able to offer any evidence for the fact that there were historical restrictions or analogs. So let me go down a few of these and ask you whether, in your experience, in your study of the Second Amendment, you are aware of any historical precedents that existed in or about on or about 1791, or secondarily in the 1860s, which were identical to these provisions, or at least analogous to these provisions. The first is the fact that the bill prohibits the wearing, carrying, or transporting of a handgun in compliance with any limitations imposed under Section 5307 of the Public Safety Article. Gives unilateral discretion to the Secretary to impose limitations which Second Amendment followers would have to comply with. Was any such provision in the law in 1791 or in the 1860s, to your knowledge?
The quick answer is no, there wasn't. And indeed, the state police have exercised that discretion for existing permits, even pre-Bruin, to provide that the permit is not valid where firearms are prohibited by law. That's a quote that appears on the back of every single permit. That means for every single sensitive area that you identify in this legislation, you will be violating not only that particular provision, you're also violating 4-203A of the criminal law article, which imposes a sentence of 3 years, and that's true under this revised bill as well. So, and that's a lifetime disqualifier. So for every prohibited gun-free zone you're creating a criminal violation of substantial proportions for every gun owner.
All right, let me go to the
And
next one.
when the witnesses answer, just, they could come to the podium, just so
Yeah.
both sides can get
Yeah.
it. Thanks.
Please go to the podium because you're caught on camera at the podium and you're not if you're sitting at the table. I don't want to direct all the questions just to one witness, but if you can answer the questions, then go ahead. So second question, on section,
Can I just?
Yeah.
It's not just in terms of the historical one. Even recently, the only states that have anything even similar now to what's being proposed here are New York and New Jersey. You can look at the 43 right to carry states, or even what Maryland previously had, or the other may issue states. This type of prohibition, these types of banning guns in large areas where people are able to go and carry under any right to carry or may issue laws is something that's entirely new, even by recent standards.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. This question is for Mr. John Lott. You could, please. So you touched a little bit in your testimony, but as I was reading your written testimony, can you expand about will gun-free zones increase public safety?
Sure. First of all, you have to ask yourself who is going to obey these types of laws. You may have a 3-year penalty on somebody who's carries a gun into an area. For a law-abiding citizen, 3 years, that's a major penalty that's there. But if somebody's going to go and commit a mass public shooting and they're going to go and kill 7, 8, 9, 10 people and already going to be facing 7, 8, 9 life sentences or more, the notion of adding 3 more years onto their sentence is completely irrelevant for whether or not they're going to be doing that type of crime. What these penalties do is they make it so that only the law-abiding citizens are the ones who obey the rules, not the ones who are attempting to go and commit the crimes. And in fact, as I mentioned earlier, this actually creates a magnet because these killers, anybody who's read the diaries or manifestos for these killers know that their goal is to get media attention. And they know the more people they kill, the more media attention that they're going to be able to go and get. And so they go to a place where they know victims aren't going to be able to go and defend themselves because they know they're going to be able to go and kill more people in that area. You may have one police officer in uniform in an area to go and guard a place. They have an almost impossible job. If you have somebody who's readily identifiable as the only person with a gun and the attack occurs, who do you think they take out first? Because they know if they take out that one person first, they're going to have free reign to go after other people there. Having people with permanent concealed handguns actually makes the job of law enforcement much safer. We've at the Crime Prevention Research Center, you can go to our website, we collect lots of different cases, like instances where people with permanent concealed handguns have stopped what otherwise would have been a mass public shooting. You don't see that occurring in Maryland or California or New York, but in the other 43 states that have right to carry laws, where you have over 10% of the adult population with a permit, I have 31 cases since beginning of 2020, where what police say otherwise would have been a mass public shooting was stopped by a law-abiding citizen carrying a permanent concealed handgun. They rarely get national news attention.
Thank
If
you,
you
Mr.
look-
Locke. I just want to make sure we just succinctly tie it up, and then I want to make sure that Senator McKay has an opportunity to ask some additional questions.
Sure, he was asking a broad question about gun-free zones, and so.
No, I hear you. We could probably go on for all night on that, but unfortunately, we don't have all night.
Thank you,
Wait,
Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, go ahead.
One
Keep going. Yeah, go ahead.
So, in your testimony, you had talked about per capita for the carry concealed permits of Maryland, Virginia. Would you repeat that again? I needed to get
Sure.
that information out. I think it's significant because Maryland is just minuscule.
Right. No, I mean, Maryland's had a big increase over the last year, and people focus on the 80-some thousand increase in permits, but it's still tiny compared to any of the neighboring states that are there. Pennsylvania, 15% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. There's actually some counties in Pennsylvania where 50% of the adult population has a concealed carry permit. Virginia and West Virginia have over 10%. That's despite the fact that in West Virginia, it's a constitutional carry state. So you don't even need to have a permit to be able to carry. And yet, in order to have reciprocity with other states, you still have a number of people who still go get a concealed carry permit. And even Delaware, which has been a May issue state, has twice the per capita rate of permits that you have here in Maryland.
And with that, And I promise, last one, sir. Thank you. You had mentioned about West Virginia, where you didn't have to have a carry concealed.
Right.
There was some concern, as I understand, looking at the media, people were concerned that it was going to become this wild, wild west and all this. So speaking to having people who are carrying and getting in disagreements, we've heard some testimony about, oh, now we're going to have all these shootings because everybody is
Right.
carrying. Has there been statistically in West Virginia an uptick
No.
in these type of?
I mean, that's true with the regard to right to carry and constitutional carry. You have 43 right to carry states, essentially. The type of concern that you're raising has been raised each and every time states have passed that type of legislation, and yet it hasn't occurred. In fact, what you can find, if you ever look at this, not one state that passed right to carry has even had a legislative hearing, let alone a vote on whether or not to move back to May issue. All of them have, once it gets passed, they get this big debate. You hear the types of concerns that are being raised here, moving to right to carry. And it's a big brouhaha. And within 6 months or a year, state newspapers around the state will have headlines saying, the types of fears, exactly the types of cases that you were raising have not occurred. And in fact, many states have very detailed data on the revocation rate for permits. And what you find is that for firearms related violations, you're talking about thousands or tens of thousands of 1 percentage point where there's any type of firearms revocation. And many of them, most of them are for trivial things like people not having their permit with them when they're carrying or going into a gun-free zone. Those are classified as firearms related violations. But the rate of convictions for firearms violations for permit holders is 1/12 the rate of convictions for police for firearms related violations. And police are convicted at 1/20th the rate of the general population. And so permit holders are incredibly law abiding. I'm not going to say you're not going to have 1 or 2 examples, but you have over 22 million concealed carry permit holders in the United States. So the fact, and we've been talking about this for decades, has been occurring. Some, you've had states over 100 years with these types of laws. And hopefully you can have more than just a handful of cases that are there. But if you look at the percent per capita rate of problems with it, it's difficult to find almost any other group in the population this is law abiding. Somebody who's going to go out and commit a crime isn't going to go and bother to go through the process to go and get a concealed carry permit. And the notion that these people are just going to lose their temper and go and do something bad with their gun just isn't happening, or you would see convictions and you would see revocations occurring.
Well, thank you for pointing out the data and not as much as I feel for people who have been victims and the emotion of such. We're challenged here to look at data and look at facts. And
Can I-
so I thank you. Sir.
Can I make one brief point
Very
following up
brief
on that?
before I get thrown out by the chairman.
Right. And that is, if my research convinces me of anything, there's 2 groups of people who benefit the most from having permanent concealed handguns. The people who are most likely victims of violent crime, that's overwhelmingly poor Blacks who live in high crime urban areas, and people who are relatively weaker physically, women and the elderly. Police are extremely important in protecting people, but the police themselves understand they virtually always arrive on the crime scene after the crime's already occurred. And having a gun, particularly for those who are the most likely victims of violent crime, is by far the safest course of action for them to take.
Well, thank you for your question, sir, and thank you for your patience, sir.
And all of you or any of you, and you can certainly get back to me because I doubt you've brought any of this with you, but we had a briefing earlier in which a Johns Hopkins professor came and gave us a brief summary of some of the research that had gone on. You were there, and I know you weren't asked to respond to it. And I've been hearing it over and over again as a reason why we need this bill. And you might remember that in this, I'll just quickly tell you, he states that there was a 35% increase in stolen firearms due to guns being taken out of motor vehicles, presumably when you had more concealed carry or permits. There was a 13% decrease in police being able to clear rates of violent crime, which they theorized. This was just, they used the word theorize. Perhaps the police were stretched dealing with other issues. It goes on in another paragraph to say depending on which sentence you want to read, that there is a 9.5% increase in violent crime, or perhaps a 12.7% increase in violent crime, or assault, or either violent crime or increase of assaults with guns when you expand the permit. And then toward the end of the article, it has 4. Now, gentlemen, I had put in some bills a long time ago in the House that actually allowed for expansion of permitting in Maryland. And at that time, I didn't have my research with me. There were a lot of studies that were completely different than this. And as a longtime lawyer, I've been in court many times when you have the battle of the experts. So, which means that you can have correlations that aren't causal. And so I would like you all, if you can, or if you can direct me to research as to whether this research is accurate, or whether there's research that contradicts this, or whether you even know off the top of your head whether there's some validity to this, because this is being used a lot, that
Right.
the idea of more permitted lawful guns will overall create more violent crime, more assaults with firearms, more thefts, and so on. So do any of you have some background in that?
Yeah, well, that's the type of stuff that I work on.
Okay.
And what you'll find, if you actually look at the study that I believe that they're referencing on that, is they don't actually relate the number of stolen guns to the crime rates. And there's lots of different types of categories, even of stolen guns. And they don't break it out by type of gun that's stolen in any way, relating it to crimes that are being committed, which seems to me the most fundamental thing that you can do. I've actually gotten that data from when I've been working in the federal government. I've seen it, and there's no relationship between.
We have 43 states that have shall as
Right.
opposed, or right, shall versus may. So I would think there has been data in those 43 states or nationally about whether or not crime goes up, violent crime goes up, crimes with guns goes up in all of these states that have a lot more permitting.
Right.
So do we, and you don't have to do it right now, but I'd like to see some studies on that particular subject, regardless of what the outcome is.
Sure.
I just want to see beyond what this one researcher brought us.
Right. Well, I have a book, More Guns, Less Crime, from the University of Chicago Press. The 3rd edition came out in 2010. And what I do in that research, which none of the people on the other side look at, is actually how the changes in number of permits in states. So everybody else who looks at this, they'll just go and have what we call a dummy variable, which just kind of looks at the before and after averages. But there's huge differences in the states in terms of the percentage of permits that are issued. I'll give you an example. You look at Illinois and Indiana, they're right next to each other. Indiana has over 22% of the adult population with a concealed carry permit. In Illinois, it's 4%. Why the difference? In Illinois, it costs $450 to go through the process to go and get a concealed carry permit. In Indiana, it's $0 now to be able to go through the whole process to get it. And so not only do you see a lot more permits, but you also see a change in the mix of people who go and get permits. In Illinois, it's overwhelmingly wealthy white males who live in the suburbs who get concealed carry permits. In Indiana, you see a lot more poor minority zip codes that have relatively more permits being issued there. If you're going to have a reduction in crime, it's not just going to be related to the percent of the adult population with permits. It's also going to matter whether the people who are getting permits are the ones who are most likely have crimes committed against them. If you can have a high percentage of people in safe suburbs having permits, but you're not going to see the same reduction in violent crime as you're going to see if you have the people who are the most likely victims of violent crime in urban areas, which are going to be having the permits that are there. And what you find is once you account for the differences in state laws, there's a very clear relationship between the percentage of the population with permits and the reduction that you see in violent crime rates.
And that's what your book goes over?
That's my book, More Guns, Less Crime, and there are other studies.
Okay, I'd like to get some of that. Sir, do
happy
you want to
give it you.
respond?
Mr. Lott, you've published several books, and obviously you've been cited for over 30 years or maybe longer than that for your work here. Are you still affiliated with the University of Maryland?
No, I'm not.
Okay. Your nonprofit is?
The Crime Prevention Research Center.
Got it. Is it a C3 or is it a?
Yeah, 501c3.
Okay. It's not politically affiliated though.
No, it's not. We have, our academic board has people at Harvard, University of Chicago, the Wharton Business School, University of Michigan, Emory, other places. We have people on both sides of just about any crime debate that you can think of that are on our advisory board.
If you could, I haven't looked at, if you could provide some of the statistics or the reports, I know that Senator James has requested it, but, and then even maybe a list of your books, but also a little bit of description. I'll make sure that members of the committee have it for the
I'd be happy
nonprofit. Okay, thank you very
I'd be
much.
Happy to do that.
I
Sure.
appreciate it. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.